Thank you. I'm Mike Muha. I'm an Army veteran, Vietnam, 1968-69. Veterans for Peace is an international organization. There's chapters throughout the U.S. and in the U.K. and in Vietnam of military veterans and our supporters that we work to increase public awareness for the cost of war, restrain our government from intervening in international affairs of other countries, to end the arms race and reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear arms, seek justice for veterans and victims of war, and seek to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. Our local chapter is Chapter 93 here in Washtenaw County, the Utah Phillips J. David Singer chapter, and our main activities include presentations like this on Martin Luther King Day, and we've done this for the last 8-10 years, something like that. Here at U of M, we were there this afternoon, down in Eastern Michigan and some other places in this area to talk about Martin Luther King's views on war, militarism, and things like that. Other activities are what we call Arlington, Michigan, that on Veterans Day at Veterans Park here, and on Memorial Day at Grand Circus Park in Detroit, we set up displays with one marker for each U.S. military person killed in Afghanistan and Iraq from Michigan. It's like 231 markers. And we do that, first of all, to honor the people that have fallen in wars and to provide a place for their friends and relatives to grieve. On these markers, we have a picture of the person, where they served, when they were killed, and several times we've had people come up and said, you know, that's my son, that's my brother, that's my friend. And we give them the markers to take with them, and it's a very moving experience. We also do this to educate people on the costs of war. If these 230 people died, why did they die? You know, what does it mean to you? And also to educate citizens on the needs of returning, because in the wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, something like 3 times as many military people have died by suicide than were killed during the wars. So it stays with you. And even, like I said, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and people that served in Vietnam still are suffering to this day. So that's some of the long-term costs of war. We also engage in full disclosure recruiting. And what we do is counsel youth that are thinking about joining the military or want to know more about what it's like in the military and that kind of thing. And we touch on items that recruiters tend not to touch on. So for example, you can say, okay, I want to be a mechanic. And you sign up for the mechanic, but what they don't know if they don't read the fine print is that if the military says, well, we don't need mechanics, we need infantry, so you're going to go to infantry. And even though you signed it, it doesn't matter. They can tell you where to go and when to go. So that's something people don't know about, and we try to let them know about that. We also have a peace scholarship program. We've been doing this since 2007. We decided that we wanted to give scholarships, and we're thinking of ways of raising money, and we said, well, let's see if we can get some local musicians to volunteer their time and sing some songs. Let's do it around John Lennon's birthday, because he's a big peace guy. And so we wrote a letter to Yoko Ono, John's widow, asking, saying, we want to do this, but, hope there's no legal ramifications or anything we're going against. And about 2 weeks later, we got an envelope back with a check for $10,000 from her to fund the scholarships. And after that, every year, we host a show at the Ark with local musicians donating their time and talent. And the money raised is for our scholarship fund. In October, we had, I think, 20 musicians doing their own songs or John Lennon songs. So it's a really, really good deal, so watch out for that in October. Veterans for Peace aligns with Martin Luther King's philosophy in several ways. One is nonviolence. Obviously, King was a strong advocate of nonviolent resistance, and Veterans for Peace upholds that as a principal core value. Anti-war, well, we're Veterans for Peace, so obviously we're for peace. And King was a vocal critic of the Vietnam War and believed in the power of diplomacy over military intervention. Social justice. King fought for racial and economic justice. Veterans for Peace advocates for the right of marginalized communities and addresses issues of poverty and community organizing. King emphasized the importance of grassroots organizing and community activism. Veterans for Peace mobilizes its members and organizes events to raise awareness of issues for peace and justice. This talk is called Martin Luther King and Militarism, how King might react today. And Bill's going to talk a lot more about militarism. But something to keep in mind is that the military, we don't consider it bad or unnecessary, but it's a two-sided coin. On the one hand, it helps maintain national security, protects the country's interest. On the other hand, it can lead to an arms race, bloated government spending, weaponization of civilian peacekeepers, and increased potential for conflict. So we'll go to Bill now, and then I'll close it up and we'll have questions and answers afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Mike. What I hope to do here is, King was basically involved publicly in civil rights from that late 1956 till early 1968. And so his views on militarism changed over that 10, 11-year period. And what I like to do is, using some of the speeches that he had, some photographs, and show where he started with his views of militarism and how things changed over time, and then present some material about how militarism is today, how it is today as compared to where it was when King was there, and then speculate on how King might respond to the changing idea of militarism. King became a preacher in Montgomery, Alabama, excuse me, in mid-1955. And at that point in time, that's when Rosa Parks got thrown in jail for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And at that point in time, the preachers in Montgomery got together and said, we've got to do something about this. So they formed an organization, and at that point in time, paid Rosa Parks fine, got her out of jail, but they also decided that that was the time to make a statement, a public statement about the racism that was going on in Montgomery. Well, of course, the authorities at that point in time didn't like anything to do with that, and they responded with a heavy hand to anyone that was on the bus that wouldn't give up their seat. They were jailed. If they got off the bus at the wrong spot, they were thrown in. If they're thrown off the bus in the wrong spot, they were jailed for trespassing and that kind of stuff. And eventually, what happened a year later is that King and the other preachers at that point in time decided to form an organization and go beyond Montgomery. That was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. At that point in time, they got together and they decided that that group was going to try to emphasize the issue of racism in the South. Right? So racism was an issue that they worked on at the beginning of this kind of 10, 12-year period. The government came out and said that, yes, you should be able to ride a bus anywhere you want, sit anywhere you want, and therefore we declare that. Well, the city of Montgomery came out and said, well, we don't care what you say. We're going to arrest these people. We're going to lock them up. We're going to go so far as if you come out and protest against that, we're going to bring the dogs out, bring the fire hoses out, we're going to lock you up, and this and that. And that's basically what happened through the late 50s, 57, 58 at that point in time. When the preachers got together, they formed this group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And what happened at that point in time is that a bunch of people from the North decided that they were going to ride buses through the South and make a statement. Well, the trouble is that the government said, yeah, yes, you can ride the buses, it's interstate commerce, and there shouldn't be any problem. Well, that isn't what happened. They rode these buses, got off the buses, and immediately were arrested for trespassing, or even worse, the dogs were sicked on them, they were locked up, That kind of stuff was going on. This happened not only in Montgomery, but Albany, Georgia, and Atlanta, other places throughout that area. And it went on, beside these freedom marches, or excuse me, freedom rides at that point in time, they were going to make a statement down in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama was a very wicked spot. The chief of police, Bull Connor, would have nothing to do with anyone that was riding the bus or getting out on the street, walking to the town hall to register to vote. African Americans were allowed to vote if they could register. And some of the exams they had to take to get the right to vote were outrageous. For instance, can you name every Supreme Court justice in the state of Michigan? Well, if you can, when's their birthday? You don't know? Well, you don't get to vote. The tests that they gave these people were outlandish. So you had people, thousands of people that were eligible to vote, but they couldn't vote in Birmingham. So to raise the awareness of voting was one of the main focuses in Birmingham. Of course, King marched, got arrested, thrown in jail, and when he was thrown in jail, he got a letter from the primarily white preachers in Birmingham and rabbi saying that what you should do in Birmingham is back off. You should back off and wait, let the courts handle this. And King says, obviously you have never been put in the same situation as African Americans, as black Americans, obviously. And if we wait for the courts to do something, it's going to take forever. So they completely ignored that, and he wrote a letter to these preachers called The Letter from Birmingham Jail. If you ever get the chance to read that, please do. It's a remarkable piece where he takes them and levels them and tells them that they've got to get their act together if they're going to be preachers, things like that. That was in late 1963. In 1964, King got a kind of a surprise. He won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he gave a speech at that point in time, and I'm going to play it here, if I might, that will show you what he was thinking at that point in time. Now, you have to remember, prior to this 1963, his aim was primarily at racism, primarily at the issue of racism. In this speech, he opens it up even further. Well, let's see. The Nobel. And what I'm going to do.
Every man lives in two realms,
Oh.
the internal and the external. The internal is that realm of spiritual ends expressed in art, literature, morals, and religion. The external is that complex of devices, techniques, mechanisms, and instrumentalities by means of which we live. Our problem today is that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. The problem of spiritual and moral lag, which constitutes modern man's chief dilemma, expresses itself in three larger problems which grow out of man's ethical infantilism. Each of these problems, while appearing to be separate and isolated, is inextricably bound to the other. I refer to racial injustice, poverty, and war. The first problem that I would like to mention is racial injustice. The struggle to eliminate the evil of racial injustice and It constitutes one of the major struggles of our time. A second evil which plagues the modern world is that of poverty, like a monstrous octopus. It projects its nagging, prehensile tentacles in lands and villages all over the world. Almost 2/3 of the peoples of the world go to bed hungry at night. So it is obvious that if man is to redeem his spiritual and moral lag, he must go all out to bridge the social and economic gulf between the haves and the have-nots of the world. Poverty is one of the most urgent items on the agenda of modern life. A third great evil confronting our world is that of war. Recent events have vividly reminded us that nations are not reducing, but rather increasing weapons of mass destruction. But with it, most of the time, human beings put the truth about the nature and risk of the nuclear war out of their minds because it is too painful and therefore not acceptable, does not alter the nature and risk of such a war. The device of rejection may temporarily cover up anxiety, but it does not bestow peace of mind and emotional security. So man's proneness to engage in war is still a fact. If we assume that life is worth living and that man has a right to survive, then we must find an alternative to war. Therefore, I venture to suggest to all of you and all who hear and may eventually read these words that the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence become immediately a subject for study and for serious experimentation in every field of human conflict, by no means excluding the relations between nations. We will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It is not enough to say we must not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but on the positive affirmation of peace. In short, we must shift the arms race into a peace race. If we have the will and determination to mount such a peace offensive, we will unlock hitherto tightly sealed doors of hope and transform our imminent cosmic elegy into a psalm of creative fulfillment. All that I have said boils down to the point of affirming that mankind's survival is dependent upon man's ability to solve the problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war. The solution of these problems is in turn dependent upon man squaring his moral progress with his scientific progress and learning the practical art of living in harmony. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. And this is our great challenge.
Interesting, when you listen to that speech closely, he talks about the interconnectedness between racism, poverty, and war. War is the element of the militarism that we'll concentrate on in this talk. In 1964, when this came out, Vietnam was just barely starting. So when he was talking about anti-militarism, he was talking about anti-war. We'll see as the time progresses that militarism takes on a much broader definition, and King changes his view of militarism as the time goes on. After the Nobel Prize in 1965, King continued working on issues of racism, primarily in Selma, Alabama, where it was almost, it's a debate, it's almost as vile as Birmingham, Alabama was earlier. The violence, the sheriff came out there, the arresting people, people blowing up buses, people going down there and, lynching people, that kind of open violence. And of course, at this point in time, it was all broadcasted on television. So people around the country got to see the real terribleness that was going on in the South at that point in time. As things developed, after Selma, King came out and says, this is a Southern issue here, but racism, poverty, and militarism happens all across the country, all over. What we need to do is go to the urban centers, the North, and address the issue there. Well, which he proceeded to do. He looked at Baltimore, looked at Buffalo, and decided that Chicago was the place to go, because Chicago has some particularly interesting, particularly hard places of racism going on there, and dealing primarily with poverty and those issues, the relationship between racism and poverty. In Chicago, the slums were terrible, and they were systematically built into the system. The realtors at that point in time in Chicago would not sell places to African Americans. If you wanted to buy a house as an African American, you had to go in this area of town, the slums. The schools that were connected to that area of time were way subpar. And so King got in touch with Mayor Daley and said, something's got to be done about this. And so what we need to do is talk to the realtors and get them to sell houses and open up open housing in Chicago, so that the housing issue would fold over into the poverty or sharing the wealth issue, which would have an impact on racism. The three are intricately connected. Well, the realtors, they came out and said, look, we just sell property. We just sell property. If somebody doesn't want to sell their house to a black person, well, we won't sell it to them, but it's not our fault. It's their fault if that's what they wanted to do. And King said, that's not right. You've got all sorts of things at your disposal to open the market to everyone. And so they sat down with Mayor Daley, the realtors, and ultimately the realtors made a gesture that says, yes, we'll work towards this. And Daley said, good, all right, they're going to work towards that. So you back off, King, and we'll work towards that. Well, King said, well, okay, if they said they'll do that, we'll back off a little bit. But we're going to still march until we see something happen. Well, Daley, the next day, went to the courts and came out with a court order that they could not demonstrate in Chicago anywhere. So on one side of his mouth, he was saying, good, everything's going to be fine. The next side of his mouth was, boom, the axe came down, and Chicago basically was closed. King got kind of snookered on that deal at that point in time. By the late 67, two things were going on that impacted King. One, he was just getting waylaid by Daley, waylaid by the open housing issues, and the intricate connection between poverty, racism, and militarism. And at that point in time, 1967, the war, Vietnam War, was, well, pretty much at its height. Johnson had sent over 300,000 troops over there. Bombing was going on, considerably heavier than 1964. And so King got tired, and he went to Jamaica to work on his fourth book at that point in time. While in Jamaica, he got a copy of Ramparts magazine that changed his way of looking at the Vietnam War considerably. And managed to get if I can pull it up here, managed to get the picture of Ramparts magazine that King looked at. And these were the pictures that he saw. The cover. A mother with her hand gone. This article was called "The Children of Vietnam." These pictures in January 1967 threw King into a tizzy. At that point in time, the idea of racism in America, the idea of fighting poverty, took a back seat to the idea of what was going on in Vietnam, the idea of militarism. And so King said, I cannot go on one step farther without addressing this issue, without us putting an end to Vietnam War. Now, what happened at this point in time is that King was approached by the anti-war people around the country, and they asked him if he would give a speech about anti-Vietnam. And on April 4th, 1967, he went to New York City at the Riverside Church and gave a speech there, a real powerful speech. I'll give you a short excerpt here, because what we'll see is that kind of the philosophy that he had in 1964 for the Nobel Prize more than subtly changes by 1967. Let's see if I can get this up.
I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. That is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. And then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader? And thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. As if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1954. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. And finally, as I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. True revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill shall be made low. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. And if we will only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Doesn't take much to see that his view of militarism, which was anti-warism in 1964, is completely more complex by 1967. We need a revolution of values here. We need to recognize that there's a connection between militarism and poverty as well as racism at this point in time. King got really blasted by criticism for making this speech, primarily by some of the liberal media. New York Times called him, by trying to mix civil rights with militarism, he's bringing two problems that are completely different and trying to stick them together. The Washington Post said he did a completely disservice to his issue of civil rights. The only kind of major newspaper that was positive was the Detroit Free Press, ironically. And it turned out that, you know what, those poor newspapers just didn't get it. They just didn't see that there is a connection between militarism, poverty, and racism. They just didn't get them. And even King's own people, that is to say, people who ran the NAACP, CORE, other organization that felt that he shouldn't have brought up the two issues. They were taking away from civil rights. And King just said, I can't do that. There's a strong connection here. There's a major connection. I just can't do it. But it hurt him that even his allies were coming out down against him. So from the mid-1967, he was kind of in a funk, if you will, at that point in time. What we see is that we wonder about what he had to, how his views, how they might be looked at today. I'm going to show some pictures here of what's going on today, and we can speculate on what King might have said about it. Let me just pull these up. What if he saw these pictures? There's no doubt about it, these are not dissimilar to the pictures that he saw in 1967 of Vietnam. These are pictures from Gaza. I think King would probably look at those and say things haven't changed one iota, one little bit going on there. But when we look at militarism and that stuff, anti-warism, that's pretty much the same. But militarism has got more complex, particularly today. We'll look at some other things about and see if we can come up with a new definition of militarism. What if we saw this? This is a police vehicle, not a military vehicle. Oops, I lost it into the other world. Bear with me, please. Thank you. I find this picture very, 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 very symbolic. Look at the non-police people. They're dressed in everyday, they're us. But look at them, what they're wearing. Armor, everything, everything. These are bulletproof vest, bulletproof thing here. That's what militarism is today. And we go on, continue to look at these. We see that now who are the enemy? Black Lives Matter. Stop killing us. The issue of militarism, it takes on a completely different role today. So what we see is that militarism today is not necessarily the whole relationship between the military and war, and its relationship between poverty and racism has changed as well. What we see now is the militarism as exemplified by the police department, even other subtle little things. There's more guns in America than there are people, which is a direct connection to militarism. I know a friend of mine that's got an AK-47, a military rifle that he uses for deer hunting. What's going on here? Anyway, so we see, I think we can speculate, or we can guess, how King might have responded if he was around today. Its images here. There was something that a nice short quote, nice short story in 1967 that he gave about the relationship between the three evils. And I'll play that as a finale here because it just fits the perfect, if I can find it. Nicodemus. There it is. There's the blurb. I'm sorry, I had this all set up, but it's gone.
Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. And if you will let me be a preacher just a little bit. One night a juror came to Jesus. And he wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach of what you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, Nicodemus, now you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something altogether different because Jesus realized something basic. That if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again.
America, you must be born again. And I think if King saw these photos, the recent photos, and looked at what's happening in American culture today, he would still insist that America needs to be born again. They need new values. They need to get rid of capitalism, get rid of exploitation, and that's based on what he said in the past. I think this is where he would be today, speculating. Thank you very much.
So to follow up on one thing that Bill talked about, the pictures of the children in Vietnam that were disfigured. Well, Kathy and I and our friends Tim and Connie, Tim's a Vietnam veteran also, went back to Vietnam just before COVID. And we visited Hanoi, where they had a workshop for people or parents or grandparents were injured in the Vietnam conflict. Disfigured children, people with one leg, saw one person with no fingers and two thumbs that were affected by Agent Orange and by unexploded ordnance. So back from 50 years ago, they're still suffering from that war. And by the way, Vietnam now is a very friendly country, beautiful country. We had a great time there. We actually had lunch with a Viet Cong soldier. Our guide arranged that. He took us to his farm. His wife made us a beautiful dinner. And he said he holds no animosity towards us, that it's the big guys that start the wars and guys like us that fight and die in the wars. That was very moving. Talking about the military, again, it's not the military, it's militarism. In fact, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military in January 12th, 2021, stated that the actions on January 6th were a direct assault on the U.S. Congress, the Capitol building, and our constitutional process. The rights of freedom of speech and assembly do not give anyone the right to resort to violence, sedition, or insurrection. Any acts to disrupt the constitutional process not only violate military values, but the law. So, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that. So the military really isn't the problem as much as militarism. And we need to be aware of creeping militarism. For example, massive defense spending. The 2023 budget is $816 billion. You say, well, we've got to support the troops. Well, the troops get maybe 20% of that. And that includes, their pay, their housing, their medical, the different programs to support them and their families. So there's a whole bunch of money that doesn't go to the troops. It goes to defense contractors, things like that. Goes to, what were you saying? There were 700, we presented the same talk this morning at U of M, and somebody said there were 700 and some bases outside the U.S. that are supported by this. Well, wasn't there an audit about the money? Well, there have been audits. In the latest audit, there were 29 components. 7 of them had passing marks. That means 22 of the components, they don't know where all the money went. And the war has to be paid for. And the more money that goes into the military and goes toward war means less money going to human programs. And King said, then came the buildup in Vietnam, and we had to spend the money there. There's a good article in the Harvard Gazette in March 2023 about militarism and civilian life. The police, for example, as Bill showed, the armored personnel carriers that the police are getting. And a lot of this stuff goes to small towns that don't know how to use it or can't use it. We have the police doing paramilitary teams, paramilitary tactics, and seeing citizens as enemies. It's us versus them instead of us supporting them. And of course, racism also is involved. Video games. There's a lot of violent video games around. Sports, especially in football. You see displays of jet fighters going overhead and soldiers marching on the field carrying flags. It's all part of militarism. And something that I didn't think about until recently, many former military leaders are in dominant positions in national security to the detriment of diplomatic solutions. So what can we do? One thing is get your news from reliable, factual sources, from different sources, not everything from the same place. And support this work financially. Support groups that promote Dr. King's ideals, like Veterans for Peace and other groups. And vote. Support the candidates, work for the candidates, and especially this year, need to get out to vote. One last thing. In King's Riverside speech, the Beyond Vietnam, he laid down this challenge. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of a born-again world, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution in values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. So thank you, and any questions or comments?
Yes. Any questions? Yep. And you do have to speak into the mic. It's scary, but for our live stream watchers at home.
Hi. So I'm curious about how King's views on militarism have been received within the military. And since you're veterans, I'm wondering if you can think about this through the prism of your own experience. So like when you were active duty soldiers, were King's views known, well known, in circulation? Did fellow soldiers agree or disagree, have strong opinions one way or the other? And then after, when you were veterans, obviously these ideas circulate among Veterans for Peace, but I'm wondering about what about the wider networks and communities and groups of veterans? Does his views have any resonance with them, or you know, and has it risen or even fallen over the decades in any kind of way? It's a very sort of historical, kind of reflective question, broad.
Well, when I was in Vietnam, I didn't know anybody that wanted to be there. That most of the people, well, yeah, most of them were draftees. They got drafted. I was drafted, and at the time I was drafted, this was 1968, they were drafted into the Marines. Nothing personal, Bill. Bill was a Marine. But I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I didn't have real strong, pacifist convictions, but I heard about what was going on, and I said, I don't want to go to Vietnam. And I didn't have the courage to resist or to go to Canada. So I enlisted in the Army, and I chose a military occupational specialty that I thought would be pretty safe, quartermaster. So, okay, I'll be a supply sergeant. I'll go to Germany or something like that. And I had some computer training before that, and so I went through basic training and advanced training and then specialized training in computers. I thought, hey, cool, I'm going to work a computer. Well, what I didn't know is the computers I was working on were supply chain computers that only were used in Vietnam. So I got shipped out right away. But again, the people that I talked to were in my position where they volunteered because they didn't want to maybe be in the infantry. Some of them had strong ideas, some of them didn't. I know that I subscribed, there was a newspaper out of Wayne State back then called the South End, I think. Anyway, I subscribed to that and passed it around, and people read it and really appreciated that. As far as afterwards, after I got out, I wasn't really too vocal in being against Vietnam. There weren't really any groups around that I knew of, and I went back to get my degrees. And one day I was walking around campus and saw Veterans for Peace. I don't know if it was during a parade or something, but I saw Veterans for Peace. I thought, hey, I'm a veteran and I'm for peace. So I joined up then and been involved since then.
I was 17 years old in 1967. I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything. I knew who MLK was, but I didn't know what he said. I didn't know what he talked about, anything like that. And it certainly wasn't a central issue in the military, at least the Marine Corps where I was, wasn't an issue at all. what he said or what he didn't say or this and that. Not to suggest that we were all in the military too, that were pro-war. On the contrary, there was a number of us that were anti-war, but we didn't know what King had to say, and so it didn't have a major impact on what was going on. It was only later that I recognized that, yes, I do have a fundamental pacifist attitude, and probably if I would, well, I know for a fact that my younger brothers, I have 4 younger brothers, I told them that they will never go in the military because I'll take care of them if they do. And so I don't think that King's words per se about militarism were really that centrally involved. Certainly his ideas on racism and probably poverty had much more impact on American culture than militarism did.
Yeah,
So-
can I add something? In Vietnam, again, a lot of the black guys did the Black Power salute. So it was more that than, King's stance on militarism.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them would go, like this. But again, there was no talk about King and militarism back, and at least not much that I had heard.
Yeah.
Questions?
I too consider myself to be a pacifist. However, I also look at the conflict that's going on in Ukraine right now, and I would say the relative obviousness of Vladimir Putin as an evil individual trying to crush another nation. Where do both of you, or where does the Veterans for Peace kind of land on American diplomacy or sending munitions and various things to Ukraine to help fund and fight back against a power that's invading? Where do you feel like you land on that?
Well, one thing is my grandfather was born in Ukraine, so I've got some personal stuff there. Veterans for Peace is against military intervention, the organization, but it's a democratic organization, so we think what we want. I think there should be a lot more diplomacy. I haven't seen enough of that. At the same time, I think we should still help Ukraine. I think we should be part of NATO and push NATO to go and help them, because they're in a bad situation.
That's a tough question. We had similar questions asked this afternoon at U of M. My own way of looking at it is that the military is, you've got defense on one hand and offense on the other hand. I mean, we need the military, I think, for defensive purposes. We don't need it like Vietnam. We don't need the military to go in there on offensive reasons. And that's basically what happened in Vietnam. They claimed it was protecting us from the communists and all that, but it was definitely an offensive move. I don't think, if my way of looking at it is that we don't need to do anything on that offensive move. Now, we might be willing to give them arms and things like that for them to help themselves, but I certainly wouldn't want us to go over there and get involved deeply in that kind of conflict. I think it would be disastrous. That's my point of view.
Yeah, I think a little bit more that we should be doing more on the economic side to hurt Russia, to really make them pay for this war.
Now, we probably have time for about one more question, if it's out there. Mm-hmm.
So Martin Luther King said something about that money was maybe starting to flow towards programs for the poor and so on, and then Vietnam came along, and that the war kind of took over that money that could have been spent for that kind of thing. This may sound like a simplistic question, but do you think that Vietnam and maybe other wars were almost engineered for the profits of the the weapons providers and so on. I know a lot of people make money off of wars.
Well, there's certainly, that seems obvious, that somebody's making a lot of money. And particularly if they're hanging out on the offensive side, they claim that everything they're making is for defense, but yet you don't see it. The ironic thing is that King also took to task the space program. All that money that went in for the 10 years to get us to the moon was money that had a direct bearing on schools, direct bearing on housing, that kind of thing. So there was not only the militarism involved in it, but the money for the space program. Ironically, we've got a space program now. The one that just blew up here, one just blew up here a week ago. Billions of dollars. It just, where'd that go? Went into a hole in space somewhere. You know, so that's part of it there, all for the glorification. I don't know if you can claim that somebody's making a lot of money on that deal, but certainly the money is being ill-spent as far as I'm concerned.
And defense contractors spend a lot for lobbying, legally and otherwise.
Let's give a round of applause for Mike and Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.